Welcome to our coffee house tonight. We're in Ezekiel chapter 23. I don't usually try to handle such a large chapter in one night, but it's actually a parable from God through Ezekiel to Jerusalem especially, but it's really to Jerusalem and Samaria, and I'll explain the whole parable. It was interesting. I always talk with Mindy beforehand. She's with the girls who are preparing for finals tomorrow, and she said, so what's chapter 23 about? I said, it's the parable of Whoredom. Now she said, are you going to be talking about our garage? I said, our garage? She thought I was saying the word H-O-A-R-D, hoarding, whoredom, like we're hoarding stuff in our garage and our garage is full. I said, no, this is horror, W-H-O-R-E-D-O-M. And she went, oh. And I said, yeah, it's really, historians call this one of the more graphic chapters of the Bible. Aren't you glad you're here tonight? Or if you found us by the internet, you're going to get into the graphic language of God. You don't think about God using graphic language, but it's how he describes sin in some ways, so that it's a sobering thought in the things that are taking place. So we're going to jump in. There's 49 verses tonight, and they come in big sections of this parable. Interesting, through the book of Ezekiel, God many times, as you've seen, he's used parables to teach them, and tonight it's this parable. We start with the first 10 verses. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man. Now, when you hear that, it's really son of dust. He's talking to Ezekiel there. There were two women, daughters of the same mother. They become prostitutes in Egypt, engaging in prostitution from their youth. In the land, their breasts were fondled and their virgin bosoms caressed. The older was named Aholah, and her sister was Aholibah. Yeah, I worked all afternoon and on the names of these. I'm 99% sure that's how you say them. They were mine and gave birth to sons and daughters. Aholah is Samaria, and Aholibah is Jerusalem. Aholah engaged in prostitution while she was still mine, and she lusted after lovers. The Assyrian warriors, clothed in blue, governors and commanders, all of them handsome young men and mounted horsemen. She gave herself as a prostitute to all the elite of the Assyrians and defied herself with all the idols of everyone she lusted after. She did not give up the prostitution she began in Egypt, when during her youth men slept with her, caressed her virgin bosom, and poured out their lust on her. Therefore I delivered her into the hands of her lovers, the Assyrians, for whom she lusted. They stripped her naked, took away her sons and daughters, and killed her with the sword. She became a byword among women, and a punishment was inflicted on her. Okay, let's talk about the parable and the players here, and what is God sharing at this point here. The mother in this parable is Israel. The one daughter, Aholah, is Samaria, and Aholibah is Jerusalem. Okay, so these are the players here, talking about the whole nation. Now, even though it says one is Samaria and one is Jerusalem, they also represent the bigger parts of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom also. Okay? What are they guilty of? They're guilty of three things: spiritual, sexual, and national whoredom. That's what God is laying as their guilty verdict upon them. Historically, where are we? We are moments away from the siege and the destruction of Jerusalem. Next chapter, chapter 24, is where it actually takes place. And so this is God saying, here's your, it's like where the judge comes out and says, here's your penalty for all these things you've been convicted of, and this is what's coming to pass. That's kind of what you're witnessing tonight. They represent, as I said, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. Both their sins started way back in Egypt. If you notice, he's saying that this is generational sin. How interesting that it's so important that if you train up your children and those in the way that they should go before the Lord, how that protects them. But if you train them up in sins, if you train them up in learning to go to false idols and the adulterous manners of how they played with other gods as their God in Egypt and then in the wilderness, this manifests so much later that this becomes the verdict of where in captivity the temple is going to be destroyed, okay? And so they started all this way back in Egypt. The northern kingdom will be destroyed by the Assyrians. Now, this is happening 100 years before this time period. The northern kingdom, when we're talking about this, he's given a history lesson at this part about Aholah, the Sumerian city or the northern kingdom. They had been destroyed by Assyria that many years ago, and now he's saying it's coming to the other sister, okay? So number 4, if you're taking notes, the northern kingdom adopted the religions of the Assyrians. This is part of the whoredom. They went into the spiritual practices of the Assyrians that were so diverse in evil things that carried over into real despicable sexual practices, and as a nation they succumbed to desiring what other nations were like. And so that's what happened to the northern kingdom. Number 5, they desired the world more than they desired the God who set them apart from the world. Remember, God chose, these are the chosen people, that he wanted the world to see how God relates to humanity through Israel. And they desired the world more than they desired the God who set them apart. And the last point of this is what they desired destroyed them. What they desired destroyed them. This is the start of this parable, and he builds on this parable all the way through. You're going to find some parallels now in this very graphic parable to our day today, and especially to America. You're going to see some things. You're going to learn a secret about a very important part of wrath that Jesus knew when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, that most of you don't realize when he's praying what he's praying in the garden, what he had envisioned in his mind and his heart when he was praying what he did to his Father. So let's pick it up in verse 11 and go from 11 through 27 now in this. This is the part of the second half, or the other sister. Her sister Aholibah saw this, yet in her lust and prostitution she was more depraved than her sister. She too lusted after the Assyrians, governors and commanders, warriors in full dress, mounted horsemen, and all the handsome young men. I saw that she too defiled herself. Both of them went the same way. But she carried her prostitution still further. She saw men portrayed on a wall, the figures of the Chaldeans portrayed in red, with belts around their waist and flowing turbans on their head, and all of them looked like Babylonian chariot officers, natives of Chaldea. As soon as she saw them, she lusted after them and sent messengers to them in Chaldea. Then the Babylonians came to her to the bed of love, and in their lust they defiled her. After she had been defiled by them, she turned away from them in disgust. When she carried on her prostitution openly and exposed her naked body, I turned away from her in disgust. You notice I have that up there? This is God speaking. I turned away from her in disgust, just as I had turned away from her sister. Yet she became more and more promiscuous as she recalled the days of her youth when she was a prostitute in Egypt. There she lusted after her lovers, whose genitals were like those of donkeys and whose emission was like that of horses. So you longed for the lewdness of your youth, when in Egypt your bosoms was caressed and your young breasts were fondled. Therefore, Aholibah, This is what the sovereign Lord says. I will stir up your lovers against you. Those you turned away from in disgust, I will bring them against you from every side. The Babylonians and the Chaldeans and the men of Pekod and Sheol and Koah, all the Assyrians with them, handsome young men, all them governors and commanders, chariot officers, and men of high rank, all mounted on horses. They will come against you with weapons, chariots and wagons, and with a throng of people. They will take up positions against you, and on every side with large and small shields and with helmets. I will turn you over to them for punishment, and they will punish you according to their standards. I will direct my jealous anger against you, and they will deal with you in fury. They will cut off your nose and your ears, and those of you who are left will fall by the sword. They will take away your sons and daughters, and those of you who are left will be consumed by fire. They will also strip you of your clothes and take your fine jewelry. So I will put a stop to your lewdness. Hear the final. This is the judge speaking here. So I will put a stop to your lewdness and prostitution you began in Egypt. You will not look on these things with longing or remember Egypt any more. Wow. In this segment of your notes, I think it's what we learn in Ezekiel, especially more than any other part of the Bible. We learn different aspects of God that we don't talk about. In this portion of it, we're learning about a God who actually gives the consequences for our sins and carries us out. And here, we've always talked about people turning away from God. And yes, that's what it's talking about here, what Jerusalem did and Samaria did. But what this is also talking about here is tonight, God then, in his judgment of them, turns away from them. All right? Let me give you a couple things under this. There's a point in our rebellion that God, in his wrath, he turns away from his children. Many scholars believe that's actually what happened also on the cross. When Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? That God turns his back on his son to turn away from him as he becomes sin for mankind. All the sins are placed upon him, and God turns away from the son. And Jesus, for the first time within this mystical union of what we call a Trinity, one God, but yet three personhoods, he feels the separation from the Father as he steps into our place in humanity and takes the wrath of God on there. And this is the same description that you're seeing here that God is doing with the southern part of the kingdom, Judah, and especially the city, Jerusalem. In verse 21, we get this major warning: the dangers of recalling the pleasures of your past sins. I've been seeing this over and over again as God's been teaching the body of Christ in these last days. One of the things that's taken place is people say these are sins, but they aren't done with the joy of those sins yet. They still enjoy them, that they keep them over here, that they can return to the joys that they had from sin. There's not much joy in sin because there's a consequence that's coming. But there is a season within that. Otherwise, nobody would be sinning, right? And what it's saying here, there's a big danger when you remember. And he's saying, you keep looking all the way back to your ancestors, all the way back to Egypt. And this has been now passed on generationally, that you enjoy your past sins, your rebellion against God. Now, number 3, the facial mutilation, where it says they will cut off your nose and your ears and all that, was a common practice in these days to keep a harlot from being desirable. Here's the idiom within that. The idiom was, your ugly sin should be seen on the outside as a reminder of its price. That's what, and this is the language that God is using with his people, Jerusalem. That this is the consequence, that the ugliness of your prostitution and this lewdness and all that you're doing on the inside, I want the world to see how ugly that really is. And so he uses something that's very familiar to them, was a punishment for being caught as a prostitute, that they would mar their, do a mutilation of their faces so that they would be marked as a prostitute, that no men would want them. And this is what God is saying in his judgment as judge right here. Remember, all this is coming to pass very quickly. The next chapter, we see the devastation of Jerusalem and the temple and everything that takes place. And he's saying, as a judge, this is your consequence. It's very sobering when you sit in a courtroom and you listen to a judge and he says, this is the verdict, this is your judgment. There's no more discussion at this point. This is what's coming your way. That's the language of this chapter right here. Okay, now in this segment, it's very important. There's an idiom that he uses here that becomes very familiar with the New Testament that I have alluded to already, and it's going to be verses 28 through 35 in your study things. It's the cup of judgment. Very important that you catch this portion of it. This is the foundational part of it that you would understand, but there's other parts in the Bible that I'm going to take you to that will build on this, all right? So we pick it up in verse 28. And it says, "For this is what the sovereign Lord says, I'm about to deliver you into the hands of those you hate, to those you turned away from in disgust. They will deal with you in hatred and take away everything you have worked for. They will leave you stark naked, and the shame of your prostitution will be exposed. Your lewdness and promiscuity have brought this on you, because you've lusted after the nations and defiled yourself with the idols." If you notice now, he's focusing, there's the spiritual lewdness, there's the sexual lewdness that's here, but now it's saying as a nation. Does this relate to America at all? Have we gone down this path where we've left the spirituality of our nation? Have we then opened up the floodgates of a sexual lewdness within our country, and it is now affecting that we're a nation that no longer has a standard? Can you see the parallel right here? All right, verse 31. "You have gone the way of your sister, so I will put her cup into your hand. This is what the sovereign Lord says. You will drink your sister's cup, a cup large and deep. It will bring scorn and derision." That really means mockery is what the word is there. "For it holds so much. You will be filled with drunkenness and sorrow, the cup of ruin and desolation, the cup of your sister Samaria," or the northern kingdom. You could include all that. "You will drink it and drain it dry and chew on its pieces, and you will tear your breasts. I have spoken, declares the sovereign Lord. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Since you have forgotten me and turned your back on me, you must bear the consequences." Here, this is the judge. This is the verdict of your lewdness and prostitution. All right, the cup of judgment. You're seeing how this ends up in the parallel that will be coming, that came to America also in what they go on to do here. But let's talk about the cup of judgment. In your notes, I put this concept is throughout the Bible, the cup of judgment. And I give you a couple places that it's important to see the history of it. You go all the way back to David. In Psalms 75, verse 8, it says, "There's a cup filled with spices." And what it's showing is the spices means a greater or more severe effect on the drinker. That, in other words, it's doctored up with all the badness in there. All right? Isaiah chapter 51, verses 17 through 19, calls it the cup of judgment. And it says it comes with a double calamities. So in other words, it's not just one verdict that comes, there's a double portion of calamities that come when you're drinking of this cup. Now, this cup is also spoken to in two chapters in Revelation that are actually connected. In Revelation chapter 17, verses 3 and 4, and then Revelation chapter 18, verse 6, they talk about a cup of gold. And when it describes this cup of gold, it is the woman who is riding the beast, if you want to know the background of Revelation there. Who's the woman? Many believe that is the church that is riding the beast in that. Some believe the woman is Israel. Okay? Now, you get to decide. If you're looking at Hebrew patterns, this is Israel, who is this lewd person. And remember, the whole part of Revelation and this portion of history is especially for Israel coming back. I lean more towards the non-historical view that the woman riding the beast is not the church that's left behind. It's still Israel who's riding the Antichrist as the beast, and the beast is going to turn on Israel. That's how I see it in more of an eschatology, end times interpretation. And it describes this golden cup filled with abominable things, and she will drink a double portion. That's what gives me the key that it's not the church that is the apostate church that didn't believe that Jesus was coming back in a rapture and wasn't ready for that. That it's the double portion is meaning basically in this realm in Revelation, she drank from this cup once before. So who would have drank from this cup once before? You're seeing it here in Ezekiel, what Revelation's talking about. Now, think of this cup of judgment. This should give you a greater reality. I didn't put this in your notes. I wanted to just talk to you and express this to you. When Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, he says 3 times, can this cup, is there any other way, and of course he's God, he knows everything, is there any other way that we can fulfill what needs to be done without me drinking of this cup of wrath? As you see the 3 different things here, it's a spiced up cup of all of humanity from Psalms. It's with a double calamity, and what Jesus, knowing the future, the double calamity means he's not just going to be hung on the cross. They're going to whip him. They're going to pull his beard out. They're going to put the crown on. He's going to have almost like 2 deaths where he could have died just from the whippings, and then they're going to crucify him. And all the abominable things of all of humanity, past, present when he's there on Calvary, and all the future abominable things are being laid upon him. That's the cup in the garden that he says, can we do it some other way? But yet not my will, your will be done. And he drinks of that cup for you and I. Wow. Wow. And this is why Ezekiel 23, besides all that's taken place, that it's showing that Israel went through this once, they're going to go through it again. What we're going to see as we get, chapter 24 is going to be the siege that he's been preparing them for, warning them about. Now the verdict is out. We see it all in 24. 25 through 32, he deals with the nations that are around Israel. And then he moves into the future for Israel. And you're going to hear things about, can dry bones live again? And they did in 1948 as they came out of the Holocaust, really looking like skeletons, and how the prophecy of what Ezekiel gives really prophesies what we saw in the 20th century. And a nation now has come back to flourish like it said it would. But what the scriptures prophesied, that in that future, for the Holocaust, worldwide, 1 out of 3 Jews, I've shared this before, but for those that catch this one time, 1 out of 3 Jewish people in the world died during the Holocaust from 1938 to 1945. In the end times, when it's a double portion cup, 2 out of every 3 Jews will die. Very interesting that the number is a double portion when they drink the cup of wrath, as they believe the Antichrist to be the Messiah until their eyes are open and they finally declare, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. When they say that, that's the thing that will trigger. It's Israel saying those words, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. They recognize Jesus as the Messiah. That's what triggers Jesus' second coming. Isn't that cool? All right. In this final part of it, you get what I'm calling in your notes here, an inside look at complete judgment. This, you'll see such a great parallel that when you get into this parable of whoredom, when your spirituality has been compromised so much that God says that's not spirituality, that's evil. When your sexuality has been so perverse, he says, that's not my gift of sexuality to humanity, it's perverse. And as a nation, I called you to be separated and be different, but now you have perversed yourself as a nation. You see that same parallel in America. Watch what happens here in the last perversion as a nation is totally perversed. What happens within the family? Okay? Very, very important. Let's pick it up in verse 36 through 49. The Lord said to me, Son of man, will you judge Aholah and Aholabol? Then confront them with their detestable practices. For they have committed adultery and blood is on their hands. They have committed adulteries with their idols. They have even sacrificed their children whom they bore to me as food for them. They have also done this to me. At the same time, they defiled my sanctuary and desecrated my Sabbaths. On the very day they sacrificed their children to their idols, they entered my sanctuary and desecrated it. This is what they did in my house. They even sent messengers for men who came from far away, and when they arrived, you bathed yourself for them, applied eye makeup, and put on your jewelry. You sat on an elegant couch and with a table spread before it on which you had placed the incense and olive oil that belonged to me. The noise of a carefree crowd was around her. Drunkards were brought from the desert along with the men from the rabble, and they put bracelets on the wrists and on the women and her sisters and beautiful crowns on their heads. Then I said about the one worn out by adultery, now let them use her as a prostitute, for that's all she is. And they slept with her as men slept with a prostitute. So they slept with those lewd women, Aholah and Aholabol. But righteous judges will sentence them to the punishment of women who commit adultery and shed blood, because they are adulterous and blood is on their hands. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Bring a mob against them and give them over to terror and plunder. The mob will stone them and cut them down with their swords. They will kill their sons and daughters and burn down their houses. So I will put an end to lewdness in the land, that all women may take warning and not imitate you. You will suffer the penalty of your lewdness and bear the consequences of your sins of idolatry. Then you will know I am the sovereign Lord. You can see he kind of gives, after he gives this long history of how you learned to play with idols and fall in love with false religions, and you learned sexual lewdness and all these things, then as a nation, the most corrupt part of it, as we get here in this last portion, the inside of a complete judgment, the corruption's spelled out very clear in verse 37. They made money on or provided for their own needs by the killing of their own children. Hello? Do you know that's been happening around the world, but especially here in America since the 1970s? They've made a ton of money off of killing their own children in our land. 60 million just here in America. I was sharing some of this with our international girls on Sunday, telling them, I said, wow, I have probably the toughest chapter of the Bible to share on Wednesday night. And they said, tell us what it's about. And I said, it's about when a nation gets to the place where their sins in spirituality, that they've so hard against the things of God, and they've so are using religion in a way that God doesn't identify with them at all in their spirituality, doesn't identify them at all any longer in who they are as human beings because of their sexuality has gotten so bad. But then their final part as a nation, they don't even protect their own children. The number 2 here, verse 38 says, on the same day they killed their own children, they came to the temple to worship God. Now, in that day, what they were doing, they were offering their babies up to the false idols of Baal and Asherah and sacrificing them there on the fire, and then they would go to the temple of God and worship. But do you see what he's saying here? When I shared this with our 2 international girls, they said, they do that in other countries. We know this. We've seen it. When a baby's been aborted, sometimes they put the baby and they worship the baby, that they think they will get prosperity out of the aborted baby, and they wrap it up in a special way, and they name the country that our missionaries that here on Sunday are going to, that Thailand is one of the places where that's how they worship abortion there, that they'll worship the baby after it's aborted, and that many of them then will sell the baby at high prices out there. They believe it's a sign of prosperity. As my high school international kids told me this, I said, wow, we sell baby parts here in America, and we march in the streets in America for the right to be able to destroy your children here. And yet many Christians will vote for a government leader that will allow them the right to do this. Wow. And they say they're Christians. I don't know how they go together in that. Verse 46 says, this is the outcome of the complete judgment of that. Those they served with their prostitution are the same mob that will destroy them. Isn't that interesting? Those that got rich off them, those that they said they gave them the freedom to do this with their own bodies and with their own kids, they are the ones that will destroy them. Christianity is trying to be destroyed today in America. We've already gone down the same path of what we've seen here mirrored so exactly in our spirituality, in our sexuality, and as a nation. We need a revival. Is there a remnant in America? Yes, there is. Are there good Christians? Yes, there are. You're here tonight. Those that are finding this and listening to this, you know that we need to cry out in this way that God, help us. How do we so mar those that are and mark them in a way? See, the world knew back there, if you marked them, they mutilated their faces so that what's so ugly on the inside would be seen on the outside. My prayers lately has been, God, let us see the sins of our nations, the sins of what we do with our own children. And I believe we're mutilating the young minds today so much that I feel like the family's under attack, that I'm doing my last message in Matthew this Sunday on discipleship, that the first Sunday in June, I'm doing a series called The Family, and taking us through a biblical view again so that we can get it out to our people, out to the airwaves. What's a world biblical view of the family? What did God intend? Because we're going to start teaching and have been teaching our kids. We're mutilating their minds and their spirits what gender is, what marriage is, what family is as they go to school. It's time for the Christian family to take hold and bring transformation back to their homes and generation. And I'm believing that we're going to see a transformation in families that find the Ark Church and listen to what we have, that come here. And this summer we're going to focus on the family as we're building really a family center here over the summer. I believe what's happening outwardly needs to take place inwardly. So pray for us as I'm going to get as hard-nosed as possible about what a biblical view is. I am not looking to be politically correct in any such way. This is the penalty when you want to go with culture and fall in love with the false gods of the world and the false nations out there. God set United States of America aside just like he did Israel and blessed us in this way, and we have followed the same path of what we've seen here in Ezekiel. God help us.